Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this Economist briefing hosted jointly by the University of Glasgow and the National Institute for Economic and Social Research based on NIESR's May 2020 review. And our topic today is the question on the lips of every economist across the land: what next for the UK and the world economy? And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Jagjit Chadha, who's the director of NIESR. Jagjit will be sharing his crystal ball with us shortly. And after his seminar, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, which I'll moderate. Before I introduce Jagjit, I'd like to share the exciting news also that the University of Glasgow's Adam Smith Business School has just entered into a strategic partnership with NIESR. And amongst other things, this will see us develop common research projects and workshops, build professional education programs and staff exchanges, and collaborate on producing both the UK and Scottish economy forecasts, which of course will be of huge importance during this period to come. And already we've worked together as part of a pan-UK bid for the SRC's new Productivity Institute. And I think this is just the start of a new partnership between us. I'd like to thank Jagjit and the NIESR team for all their help. And of course, my colleagues, John Finch, Don Tsoukalas, and the wider economics faculty here at Glasgow for coming together in this way. But back to today's event, I'd like to introduce Professor Chadha to you all. Before taking up his current post as Director of NIESR, Jagjit taught economics at Kent, Cambridge and St Andrews. He's worked at the Bank of England on monetary policy and as Chief Quantitative Economist at BNP Paribas. He worked there for a while and then served as Chair of the Money Macro Finance Study Group. He's acted as a Specialist Advisor to the House of Commons Treasury Committee and academic advisor to both the Bank of England and the Treasury and many other central banks, as well as the Bank for International Settlements. Jagjit, I dare say you'll have to use all that experience at the moment to chart a path through these choppy waters, but I know you're up to the task, so we're looking forward to what you have to say and the questions to come. Jagjit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anton, and thank you, Anton, and also the team at Glasgow for all their support over the past few months, but also the past couple of weeks, as we've tried to understand what is going on in what must be described as very tragic and difficult circumstances for households, firms, and most of the world. But before going on to the presentation, I also want to briefly introduce two of my colleagues who will be on the panel with me at the end. Dr. Kemar White, who's a senior economist at NIESR, and Jeanine Boshoff, who's an economist at NIESR as well. They will help me field the questions at the end, and I hope to get to my presentation at the end of my presentation in about 30 minutes or so. And I think what I just want to say is that when we approached trying to understand what was going on right now in the global economy and in the UK, I think I cast my mind back to the fact the Institute is going to be celebrating its 82nd anniversary this June. It's been publishing the review since 1959, and the first time it did a sort of forecast using an economic model was 1961. And I think it's possible to say this was possibly the most difficult forecast or period for us ever to have to deal with. Not only because of the lockdown and the sort of terrible circumstances many of us are in, or family members or friends, but also because the Institute uses as its benchmark a large global macroeconometric model of some 6,000 equations. And that is housed in the Institute building in Westminster off Smith Square on the 3rd floor, normally guarded by me and others every morning to make sure no one can access it without a key and fingerprints. But in this case, the economists and Kemar and Jeanine are two of a team of some 15 on the macro side, essentially decoupled the model and took bits of it off with them away to their homes, wherever they are, scattered around the country, and in some places in other countries, and were able to do their work and construct a global view remotely. And I just want to pay a tribute to them, if I can, before going on to this, that this was done professionally and with dedication over this period. But the beneficiaries are the public debate and the public good, because our analysis is having a lot of traction in the policies that we're now going to see. So what I'll try and do in the next 25 minutes or so is go through the analysis, possibly too fast, but I want to get to the end because I know there'll be time for questions, and we have several hundred people down the line with those questions. The slides will be made available afterwards, as indeed will this seminar, but also the chapters of the UK forecast and the global forecast we will also make available to our colleagues at Glasgow and those on the line, so that you can absorb the kinds of things that we've been thinking about at the Institute over the last few months as we constructed our forecast. So let me crack on with the main points. Very clear that these are somber and difficult times for the country and the world. This is not something anyone would have chosen to have happen to them. The NIESR review normally starts with a commentary where we regularly examine monetary and fiscal policy. And what this crisis has done, in the words of Andrew Crockett, former General Secretary of the Bank for International Settlements, is that it's really exposed existing risks that were building up through the operations of monetary and fiscal policy over the last decade or more. And these are issues of coordination, both internally and globally. When fiscal policy should dominate monetary policy, if at all? What are the appropriate targets for fiscal policy and indeed for monetary policy? And what sort of instruments do we have to implement those to meet the social objective function, by which I mean an objective that maximizes the benefits for most people or minimizes the risks that they face. And this crisis has, of course, risk attached to it, things that we think we can measure, but a whole degree of uncertainty, things that we cannot measure, that we think are nevertheless impacting on behavior of firms and households as they confront the implications of this awful COVID-19 episode. I think we've learned that the arbitrary fiscal rules that we've had in place, at least since 2010, serve little purpose. And what we need to think very hard about are targets related to social welfare criteria. So those ideas where fiscal policy really should be building up public goods in a way that they're resilient to the kind of shocks we're now facing. Monetary policy in this period can support that fiscal policy, but should not be designed in such a way as to undermine long-run price and financial stability, if only because elements of this crisis or others will come back in the future. And if we spend or eradicate all the credibility that we've built up in monetary policy over the last 2 to 3 decades, what will remain should there be further echoes of this crisis further on down the line with another peak in infections, or indeed, worse still, some further manifestation of the virus into some other form. So where did we end up when we were thinking about the UK GDP path? Now, this was published a week or so before the Bank of England's analysis that was published last week. And in a way, this is the key message and the key thing to think about in this process. The red line up to the dotted line shows the path of UK GDP. That's a measure of the quantity of goods and services that we're producing as a flow over the period. And you can see it tends to rise at 1% or 2% a year. You can also see around 2008-9 a rapid decline. That was the financial crisis. And you can also see that after the financial crisis, we didn't really recover the previous trend, which is that little bit prior to 2009. And that's what economists call scarring. Things that leave a permanent impact or a long-lived durational impact on the economy. And that's our real concern with this crisis, is the extent of scarring. And so if we turn to what's happening in this quarter, the period of April, May and June, we see a tremendously rapid decline in GDP. And depending on how you add it up, you get something like a decline of some 25% to 30%. And I'll come to how we got to those numbers a little bit later on, within the quarter of the lockdown. And the thing to bear in mind there is that the economy is being used as an instrument to limit the spread of the virus. So it is in itself the instrument by which we're controlling the spread of this horrible disease. And therefore the subsequent path of GDP, which is the red line that we see after that, is almost entirely of a function of the extent to which we can, and I'll be very clear here, safely, in a way that guards the health of the nation, ease the lockdown. I think it's the critical constraint on that. But what we see is, even if it is eased in a relatively rapid way, and we looked at an equivalent V-shape in 1921, Q2 and Q3, we think there's still considerable case for some scarring, and that is the gap between the red and the black dotted line, as the economy doesn't return to the intensity of production it had before, but also over some period there'll be some reorientation of the economy away from things that we did, recreation, travel, hospitality, towards things that we don't do so much now and will take time to build up: social care, healthcare, agriculture, and other areas over time. And that, because that transference of resources will take time, we think that there'll be some longer-lived scarring on the economy. Now, I'm not going to go through all the points on fiscal policy, but what I want to just emphasize are 2 points here. One is that we should think of this very much as a natural disaster. This economic crisis is not in itself a function of errors or mistakes by economic agents. In the sense of a natural disaster, it's something that's happened to everyone that's been outside of their control. In that world, it's very hard for firms and individuals to have insured themselves fully. So there is a prima facie case for the state to step in and provide insurance for those individuals who cannot, and I don't think we can, fully insure ourselves against the shock that we're facing. That's point number one. Point number two is that because demand has fallen so rapidly, the debate that we had a decade ago about the magnitude of fiscal multipliers, and for those of you sort of a little bit rusty as to what that means, it's the extent to which for every pound we spend, will the economy grow by more or less than that pound? If it grows by more than a pound, we tend to say there's a fiscal multiplier at work. And because we think there's relatively high levels of excess capacity at the time which demand has fallen very quickly, those fiscal multipliers may indeed be quite large this time. And that means governments have to be ready to stand ready at the national and regional level to step in and provide demand into the economy at a time to help kickstart it. And therefore, what's the role of monetary policy in all of that? As I said earlier on, it's very much simply about creating fiscal space by buying bonds and holding interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. The government will have more room to issue debt than it would otherwise have, and be able to refinance that debt in a manner that would not lead to debt exploding in a way that would concern us. We think there is room for monetary policy to do that, and to a large extent, it has already done that. The QE programme has been reignited. That's going to buy some £200 billion of government debt, taking the overall holdings of the Bank of England balance sheet to something like 30% of GDP, which we think is entirely manageable. There are some ideas out there, such as direct monetary financing or a helicopter drop. Ultimately, we think that would destabilize the demand for money in the economy and is not a tool that can be used regularly. So if I go back to my earlier point about maintaining monetary and financial credibility, by maintaining that, there is still room for the Bank of England to act again in future, should these lockdowns have to be deployed once again over the next couple of years. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to go very far into unconventional space. Now, I'd like to now turn, if I might, to the global view, on which I'll spend some 10 minutes and then some 10 minutes on the UK, and that should take me through to the time for questions. Now, what we're envisaging, once we've added up the impact of the lockdowns across the world, is that world GDP will actually fall by some 3 to 4% this year. Now, you may not, those of us who lived in the UK may not think that's terribly unusual. Every 10 years or so, we have an economic crisis that means GDP falls. But for the world as a whole to fall by that amount is not something we can observe very well at all in the whole of the post-war period. And even the data on the depression of the 1930s doesn't really construct a very good measure of world GDP. So I'm not, even though there were falls in GDP in that period, I'm not sure it's strictly comparable. So this is a huge shock to the global economy. But clearly, as a function of the rate at which lockdowns are eased and the extent to which they're coordinated across economies and monetary and fiscal policies are able to be supportive, there is every chance of a bounce back next year, which throws open a critical question for the UK as to how and when it should choose to leave the European Union. I'll come back to that point a little bit later on, if I may. I would like to go to the next slide, if I can, just there. Now, even though we have an overall view about the decline in world GDP, there's a lot of heterogeneity in that. We have a story about China, which is near the top and not seeing much of a fall at all, and various other countries that are responding in quite a different way. So the work that the team do allow us to build separate paths for the economies, depending upon the extent to which the factors that drive growth in those economies particularly matter. So for a number of emerging markets or MENA economies, they're particularly vulnerable at the moment. They will be losing overseas income through a lack of tourism. FDIs, as we'll come to in a minute, portfolio flows have turned into an outflow of tremendous amount. And a lot of these economies don't have very well developed domestic debt markets, which means that they cannot deploy fiscal policy to the extent that we can in the UK to offset part of the shock. So we're able to observe quite a lot of heterogeneity there. And indeed, many emerging economies have already turned to the IMF and the World Bank for some form of support in this period. The global GDP line is the black line until the forecast. And then we see a similar dotted line as to that I've described for the UK. What I want to show there is the distribution line. That's the red patch below that. There's the red swathe is a simulation we've done, which is saying, well, what if, apart from the peak we have this year, we were to have another spread in the autumn? What would that then do to GDP compared to our central case? And we can see it just shifts the whole thing down another 10 or 15%. And this is the great concern, that even if, as a central reassuring case, we think there's a bounce back and the economies largely recover their previous path, we have to be aware that at any time, until a robust vaccine is located, there is significant downside risk to any projection that we might have in place, which I think increases the imperative for building resilience in healthcare, social care, social distancing, and encouraging firms and others to set up production practices that deal with this ongoing risk. The policy context has, if not been impressive, at least not been too bad. Let me sort of, down with faint praise. Central banks have lowered policy rates. Treasuries have introduced fiscal stimulus programs. We question whether they're large enough and whether they've been synchronized enough and whether they provide sufficient comfort for people over the long run. It's reasonable to say we'll do what we can now, but for people planning ahead against a large amount of uncertainty, they need some idea that these things will be in place for some time. And that's where the policy coordination that we saw immediately after the great financial crisis in 2009 is still absent. We haven't had announcements at the international level that these supports will go on for some time. And I'll come to some research in a minute where we've tried to understand how important spillovers are. But the key point to think about when we come to spillovers is that in a global world where people are trading with each other, if every country contracts by a certain amount, because you have then not got a world in which there's overseas demand for your products, you will all grow much more slowly or more negatively than you would otherwise if you weren't trading to that extent. And our own work suggests that if every country was contracting by 1%, because of the extent of international trade, that is going to amplify that by something around 60% to 100%. So countries that would otherwise fall in the rate of growth by 1% may in fact see their economies contract by 1.6 to 2% because of those trade effects. Another thing hampering the growth from the return of that are the debt levels that countries may face. But at least in the short term, the problems of debt are offset by extremely low financing costs. And I'll come to that a little bit later on. So the global picture is a line that I think we'll go to next, allows you to compare and contrast the global financial crisis as an index of world GDP to what we now are seeing. And what you can see is that that global financial crisis was not really a global financial crisis. It was affecting the debtor countries, the advanced economies, who were by and large borrowing from the creditor economies, the growing economies. And that meant that, in fact, the world GDP hardly fell at all, a very small amount, 0.1% in 2009, and recovered very quickly afterwards. But what we're seeing here is a synchronized fall of an enormous magnitude, something that we just haven't seen in the past. And we think there'll be some scarring from this as well, by which we mean there'll be a persistent gap between the previous trend line and now what we're expecting to see. Good examples, if that's the right word, good may not be the right word, I apologize for that. Enormous increases in unemployment, and we've benefited from work we've got from Institute Fellows David Bell and Danny Blanchflower looking at US and UK labour markets, and we've seen increases in employment that just nobody has ever observed before. And what that will do to household consumption, confidence, as well as the social fabric in economies is something that provides us with great concern, but I haven't got answers for that for you today. I'm simply outlining what we're observing. The portfolio flows I've talked about have been enormous. These are the portfolio flows out of emerging markets since the start of the crisis. Here's a number of days on. And what you're seeing is something that is some 4 times larger than the outflows we saw during the financial crisis. And this is meaning that countries in particular that have got dollar-denominated debt are finding the capital leaving their country, putting upward pressure on interest rates in those economies and making it increasingly expensive for them to refinance that debt, and leading to domestic pressure for more unorthodox monetary policy instruments to be deployed. And therefore, we're seeing a lot of talk in these emerging economies for some use of extraordinary monetary instruments, which might mean monetary financing of debt, which of course would be of great concern, I think. Another influence is to look at the fiscal policy response. I think I've already talked about this. I'm not going to repeat what I've said. I think there needs to be a larger response, one that's better synchronized and one that has a longer duration attached to it. Economists like to use the lingo state dependent. So fiscal policy could say, for as long as there are lockdowns, we will continue to support global economies in a way as to offset the impact on output. We haven't had statements like that. We've had more nebulous statements like, we'll do whatever it takes. Why not link the response to a state contingent world in which, when there's a lockdown, we will do something for as long as it's required. I've talked about debt already. I don't think I've got a lot of time to go through it here, but simply we continually worry about the level of debt. It's been cranked up, whether it's government debt, household debt, and non-financial debt. Debt itself may not particularly matter if the whole of the balance sheet has net worth, but to the extent to which debt has to be rolled over, the maturity of debt may mean in every year or so, some large fraction of that has to be refinanced. So even if interest rates are low, if capital markets don't want to extend debt, we may see countries and firms facing all kinds of constraints in the future. So I'm holding that back as something maybe to be discussed more when we meet again in August or late July. I talked earlier on about spillovers, and one of the things we're able to do with our global model, as I hinted at some moments ago, was to say, well, look, let's imagine that every country in the world has a lockdown of some 6 to 7 weeks. The red bars there are telling you what would happen in that country alone if it didn't trade with the rest of the world. But if you throw in trade with the rest of the world, because under lockdowns you can no longer, as it were, buy in demand from the rest of the world, the impact of the lockdowns get amplified, and our average amplification is some 60% larger. But I'd like to point, if I may, for those of you interested in the euro area, the impact there is even more. It's more like doubling. And that's because every country in the euro area is heavily integrated in trade with other countries in the euro area, which is the pink bar, as well as the rest of the world. So that's why I think we're terribly worried about the vulnerability of the euro area to continuing and ongoing lockdowns, but also the extent to which trade from the rest of the world may hamper its ability to come out next year from that. I wonder if we could move on. So I think I've gone through the what next. There needs to be coordination. We must resist the temptation to impose trade barriers. I think the emerging markets have got some issues attached to them. I think also the euro area markets have some issues as well. And there's a prima facie case for development, financial institutions to do more, for us to be considering some form of debt write-offs as well. And I think that's I wouldn't say a depressing picture for the rest of the world, but I think it's a menu that requires brave, coordinated, and prompt leadership. I leave it to you as to whether you think we have that at the moment. So having done the rest of the world, we then turn to the UK. The UK is as a semi-small open economy. Before we can understand what's happening in the UK, we have to construct a picture of the rest of the world. We then construct one of the UK, allow them to interact, and we end up with a bunch of forecasts. It won't surprise you to learn that I think the outlook is extremely uncertain for the UK. I don't think that's news. In fact, Simon Lewis was teasing me the other day about saying that's what he used to say when he worked at the Institute about the 1970s, to which I said to him, well, of course, the 1970s were very uncertain. But anyway, that's something economists always like to talk about, but I'll come to the way we illustrate that shortly. Public sector borrowing will break any fiscal rule we might have written down. Unemployment is going to rise to a level we haven't seen since 1992-93. And there are some questions as to how we should ease the lockdown. And we're very clear that we could ease it in upstream sectors, government, manufacturing, construction, and some retail, that would allow positive spillovers to the rest of the economy. There may be some challenges when lockdowns are eased, because some of the costs of running a business may come back onto the balance sheet, but unless there's confidence amongst consumers, demand won't recover. So we may find numbers of firms running the costs of their business, but without the revenue to meet the costs. And that will be a significant challenge for government that may require some regional or national input into that to understand how policies could be deployed at that level. This is a chart that, on my screen at least, hasn't come out very well, for which I apologise. I'm surprised. It was fine in the run through a minute ago. But I think the main point can be made anyway. And that is, if you look at the right, all I want to point out is that kind of, I probably scribbled it myself, I'm not much of an artist, but that broad red is the 80% confidence band of output that we had 3 months ago. And if you look at the V shape of the pink and the red to the right-hand side and look at the scale is the same, the uncertainty that we now have about output is unprecedented. And I use that absolutely technically, having looked through all the uncertainty charts the Institute has been working with over the last 30 years or so. The extent to which we can be certain about where output is unprecedented. There's a 40% chance we'll still be in recession by the end of next year, even though we think as a central reassuring case, we'll pull out of recession early next year. And so, as well as there being a huge amount of uncertainty, we think a lot of the risk is on the downside. Sure, there's some upside risk if all the policies come about to stimulate the economy, the lockdowns are eased, a vaccine is found, and we're all back to work next year. There may be a risk of an inflationary boom, but we think it's more likely that lockdowns will not be eased in the way that we might anticipate, that they will be not a coordinated release from lockdown. Our main trading partners will continue to have forms of lockdown for a very long time indeed, and a vaccine may not be found very quickly, and indeed the virus may mutate. All of that leads to a view that the economy will not rebound in the way that we might envisage. I'll see about that, getting that chart cleaned up for any version that we send out to participants on this seminar. As a main case scenario, what we're showing here is the level of GDP compared to our February 2020 baseline. This is an enormous deviation from that. And what we're seeing, if we add up all those numbers, is a loss per person of some £11,000 of income over the next 5 years from the long run effects of COVID-19, the lockdowns, the reorientation of the economy, the extent to which workers are discouraged and households continue to hold back, and firms, in response to uncertainty, also hold back on investment. So how sure can we be? Well, if I'm perfectly frank, not terribly sure. We have to monitor the indicators that we have, the various surveys of activity that we have out there, as well as the impact on the economy from lockdowns, in which surveys we have out there. The ONS have a survey to try and understand which businesses can continue under lockdown, to what extent their activity can continue, and which businesses cannot. And from all of that, we were able to aggregate a bottom-up picture to get a view on the economy. And then we started to look for indicators that could corroborate that. And it was useful to look at the forecasts of electricity usage compared to actual electricity usage once the lockdown started. And for those of an older mindset, which includes me, electricity consumption was often used as a proxy for capacity utilization in some early models in the 1990s and noughties. And what we can see is that the usage of electricity compared to the forecast prior to the lockdowns is some 15 to 20% below where we would have anticipated it being, which spookily enough is about where we thought the economy is compared to where it would otherwise be. So as well as constructing a bottom-up picture and taking our view as to what might happen, we're looking at some non-standard indicators to see whether they corroborate the story. And by and large, they do. And that's why we've taken the view that we have in terms of the current impact on activity from the lockdowns and the COVID-19 tragedy. The pace of the slowdown, the best comparator we've got is not 1709 or 1708. The pre-industrial data, I think, makes comparisons very hard to make. we've got a long-lived project at the Institute to try and understand quarterly data till the middle of the 19th century, along with our friends at the ONS, the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, and colleagues at the Bank of England. And the nearest thing I think we can able to look at is the second quarter of 1921, in which there was a very sharp V-shaped recovery, but that was a state contingent contraction, very much related to a long-lived miners' strike, which was then relieved in the next quarter, seeing the return. But if we take that as a guiding principle for what we might see, I think we've used that to an extent for our reassuring view on the economy. For those of you interested in 1921, there's a box in the review that goes through some of the backdrop to that and some of the resultant doldrums, as Pigou described them, in the next period. I'll take a quick sip of water if I may. The channels of the impact are lower productivity, hours of work. I've already talked about the impact on lockdown. We think that consumers will reduce both desired consumption, but also there'll be some element of forced savings as well. And firms, both small and medium and large, will reduce investment in the face of uncertainty and expected demand for their goods. We can also envisage lower demand and supply from abroad, and there'll be a lower risk appetite, in part reflecting a higher cost of capital, but also reflecting the uncertainty of people not quite understanding whether their business will be viable in a post-COVID world. I think people are changing their attitudes to some degree as well. So we try to incorporate these in our basic story. We move on to the next, thank you. And as well as a top-down view, we've done some sectoral analysis and split the economy into the public sector, private traded, construction, real estate, manufacturing, finance, and utilities in total. And the idea here is to not only using input-output tables to understand what happens in the sector itself, which is the red vertical line, but also understanding the extent to which it spillovers onto other sectors. And so what we have is a view that what we should be doing is trying to help those sectors where we can continue to operate either in lockdown or should the lockdown be eased in such a way as to minimize spillovers to other sectors, which in this case would be finance and utilities. And we've got some reasonably strong results that suggest that there's a role here for the public sector, private traded and construction, where it can, should the lockdown be eased, in bringing forward some activity that would limit the spillovers to some of the other sectors. So there's some thinking there to be done by government and some thinking to be done in terms of which projects are bite-sized enough and ready enough to be implemented should lockdowns be eased, and in which regions could they be deployed safely. And being absolutely clear that our fundamental constraint is the health and safety of the British people and nothing else than that. I wonder if I could therefore go on to the next slide. No, next slide. Thank you, Lucas. Sorry. Slide 27. Thank you. So what we've done is we looked at the government's fiscal measures so far, and what we have is an as-if scenario on GDP, where we have for 2020, GDP would fall by some 10%, were it not for the fiscal measures announced. And what we have as a result of those is some fall by about 8%. So broadly speaking, the government is offsetting some quarter of the impact on the economy, depending on what you thought the baseline was for the UK anyway, had COVID not come along. For those of you who recall the numbers, there was precious little sign of growth anyway, so in the early part of this year. And I think our view is that there's room for a bit more. We don't think a quarter is quite where the government should be pitching its response to this crisis, and doesn't quite meet the constraint of providing insurance for a natural disaster. I think it needs to be a little bit more ambitious, and we also think that more could be done. Could I turn to the next slide? Thank you. And so what we're going to see as a result of what's been announced is an increase in debt of some 200 billion. And the red line shows debt to GDP, and we can read that from the left-hand side. It was stabilizing at about 80%. The shock that we're now looking at is going to take it dangerously close to 100%, some 95 or so percent. But the key thing I want to get across to people is that the cost of borrowing, I've looked here at the effective interest rate on debt, and that is the interest payments that we've made relative to the nominal value of debt. And you can see since the financial crisis, that's been heading ever south. So the cost of financing has fallen, and nevertheless, the maturity of debt is some 15%. That means in any 1 year, we have to roll over some 6% of debt. That's a relatively small amount. And the amount of debt we've been trying to issue so far this year has been well covered by auctions. That's a little bit of lingo, which I apologize. What it means is the government tries to sell its debt, and there's been very, very good demand for it. So I wouldn't think that there is particularly, we are anywhere near an upper bound constraint on the level of debt at the moment. So there's a trade-off. One is to ensure that we have space should the shock return or manifest itself in some more worrying way. But equally, we probably want to offset a little bit more of the shock that we're currently seeing. And I would point to the low cost of debt and the fact that because we have a very good maturity structure of debt, we don't have to finance a lot of it year by year. Unemployment, as I've said, is going to rise. And I think that just makes the case that I've said in the past. One of the problems of the unemployment we had in the 1980s is that we allowed it to persist for too long. That meant people got discouraged. It meant people left the workforce, and it meant that we lost valuable skills. And so there's a case here for the government to think hard about retraining quickly and efficiently and see if those who've lost their jobs, for example, in hospitality and retail, could not be deployed in other areas such as social care or agriculture. I think that's entirely feasible. And I think the government in the 1980s didn't pay enough attention to that. And I think retraining and universities clearly can play a role both there and in R&D are going to be critical to that story. So I don't think we're going to return to the pre-COVID normal. Many businesses will face a challenge when we release the lockdown because social distancing will remain. There'll be many fewer of us in pubs, which is a sad thing for many of us to consider, but it means we have to think, how can these businesses continue to be viable in that respect? We have an announcement today, fortunately, that the job retention scheme will be extended to October. That's something we've argued very hard for, and I think that's a good thing. I think businesses need a bit more uncertainty over the medium term, not just over the next few weeks. I think that more conventional fiscal policy is required, and there is space to do that. And the key thing underpinning all of this is the economy is a complex network of relationships, social relationships as well as economic. And what we need the government to do is to do whatever it can to ensure that those relationships are maintained and fostered. I think our relationship with Glasgow is a very good example of that, so that when and if semblance of normality returns, we can get on with things again. That's the most important thing. That's what we need our government to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jagjit. I think we have an opportunity to ask for attendees to ask questions now, and the mechanism, as you'll see on the slide, is that you raise your hand, and if you indicate that you want to ask a question, we'll come round to you. So whilst you're thinking about a question, could I perhaps, Jagjit, ask the first question?
Yes, of course.
I mean, you mentioned the need for perhaps a little more fiscal impulse in the UK and perhaps even in the G20, but let's stick to the UK. I mean, the CJRS has protected employment. You highlighted the issues around consumer confidence and business confidence. Yep. What kind of additional fiscal intervention would probably help, given that direct spending is not going to help, you know, confidence necessarily, and
Yep.
there's supply constraints anyway. So yep. what kind of additional fiscal impulse would you like to see?
Well, I think firms, it's interesting, when we looked at the 1920s, we thought one of the things that held back the recovery, and this was talked about quite extensively at the time, was something called the Macmillan Gap. You're a scholar of economic history as well, so I think you would understand the Macmillan Gap was the difficulty that businesses found in finding sufficient finance to fund their investment plans. And this was felt to be a failing of British finance in the 1920s, and I think it's a failing now. The business interruption loan scheme has stuttered. I don't think all the firms that have needed the finance have been able to get it. I think the banks themselves have often offered a sort of, I'm not sure we can help you, to firms that need that money. And there's been a scrambling around for the extent of the guarantee that might be offered. It started at 80, it then got to 100. And I'm not entirely sure, either through capital markets or through the loans, that firms have got the loans that they want. And I think there may be a case here for thinking specifically about some form of investment bank or development bank that can help small firms and others find the venture capital or the direct bank lending or access to capital markets that they really need. And I think this is something that this might be an opportunity for the government to think about. As well as that, you'll know as well as I do, there are a large number of projects from the National Infrastructure Commission that could be looked at very carefully to see which ones could be implemented. It's also the case, I think, that there are elements of social housing that could be started reasonably safely. I think I've asked some people at RICS for their opinion on that. But the extent to which they're brownfield sites, away from other people, there is probably some element, and I'd be absolutely clear, safety is my priority in all of this. But some of that could be started in a way to help kickstart the economy. So I think it just requires a bit of an imagination and examination of where the gaps are. I also would say I think there's a consensus in the economics profession on these issues. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly heterodox in any of these areas.
No, absolutely. Thank you. We've got three questions. The first one from Ali. Would you, I think you'll be called in just now. Ali, do go ahead.
Hello, I was wondering what you thought about the impact on the stock market, given that you're talking about the economics of it all. What do you think? I know it's difficult. Your view on the stock market is. Well,
I'm not licensed to give investment advice, is what I always have to say when someone asks me a stock market question. I know Kemar has been working on a project understanding the impact on stock markets. They're, of course, very volatile, and their fall increases the cost of capital. And what we've seen is a fall in stock markets that takes them very much back to where they were a decade ago. I suspect there's been something of an overreaction to that. But I wonder, Kemar, is anything of any great concern from the fall in stock markets? Is there not some sorting going on where particular firms have done badly and some others haven't done too badly? Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Kemar, from your work?
Right. So yeah, like you correctly said, Jagjit, we've sort of seen this sort of thing developing in the stock market, where it's sort of a reflection of what we're seeing in the real economy, and we can sort. I mean, we don't want to go as far as to use what's happening in the stock market as a proxy for what will happen in the real economy, but I think most sectors, as you can see, the ones that you expect, for example, in tourism and leisure and stuff like that, are highly affected, and sectors, for example, in finance, services and stuff like this, where people are able to work from home, these are not as affected as others. But like I said, we don't want to go as far as to use the stock market as some sort as too much of a proxy for what's happening, but it is an indication. It is an indicator of where we are at the moment.
Thank you. Ronnie McDonald. Ronnie, you want to ask a question?
Yes, hi, Jagjit. I thought that was an excellent presentation. I found it very helpful. My question is a general one. I mean, I think it's fascinating that we are, I think perhaps for the first time in a crisis of this nature, we are putting people's health and well-being before the efficiency of the economy. And you emphasized that a number of times in your presentation. And you also mentioned, interestingly, about building up resilience in social care, healthcare, and agriculture, which I completely agree with. And I find it interesting, you finished on the point about building networks of relationships, social and economic. So the question I have is that really what we're saying here, I think, is that we need to return to building our social capital rather than, say, the considerable emphasis we've had on financial capital in recent years. So my question is, what are your thoughts on how permanent this might be? Okay, we need to build up this resilience, this social capital to see out the crisis, but do you think this could be a longer term sea change in the economy as a result of this pandemic?
Well, that's a brilliant question, Ronald. Are you in Skye today? How are you?
Yes, I am. Thanks very much.
Yes, I'm
pretty good at the moment. Yeah,
extremely jealous, but yeah, we'll have that Talisker soon, one day up there.
Great. Okay.
That's our hope, actually. Despite the fact we're all thought of as hard-nosed economists, I think most of us do understand that social networks and relationship and the resilient provision of public goods are a sine qua non of a successful economy. And we would like to shift the debate in that direction if we can. I don't think we want to be concentrating on the financial sector. That concentration on the financial sector, I think, was revealed as a cul-de-sac in 2007, 8, 9 with the financial crisis. You know, it wasn't sufficient to balance the UK economy on being a financial entrepreneur for the rest of the world. We need to concentrate on domestic finance, the growth of firms domestically, to provide stable jobs for people in the country. And I think that is something we hope, at least, you know, once the health issues of this crisis are over, we can retain. So how do we retain them? I think we have to have continual conversations with people to make the case in the way that we've done, ensure that we have the space to do that. That needs people like you, Anton, myself, and all the people on the line, continue to make the case to shift the center of gravity of the debate towards this area. I won't be the first, and I certainly won't be the last, to talk about the enduring importance of the Beveridge report and what that had on the post-war, and the impact that had on the post-war consensus. But the Beveridge report, and I should say Beveridge was one of the founding fathers of the Institute, did not come out of a vacuum. It came out of a sense that something had to be done. And the report crystallized that in the wish to offset the evils that he identified. So we need to make the debate, convince people that these are the ways we have to go. And I'm afraid it's going to be hard work, because I think at the back of your question is this view that once it's over, will we forget all this and go back to how we were? I think it's our job to make sure that doesn't happen. And again, I think that's why I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to people of a like mind at Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland. It's going to be our responsibility to do that, I think.
Thank you. Got a question from Nazira Bradley. Nazira, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I just have two short points or comments to make, and I'd be interested in your response. One, with regard to the role of investment banking, I would be interested what you have to say about the Scottish National Investment Bank, which would be starting in July, as to what role you think, or that was the predicted timing, as to what you think could be the role for Scottish National Investment Bank, at least for the Scottish economy. And secondly, I totally agree with you about farm growth being a key issue. And what you mentioned over there about the aspect of retraining, only I think what I want to point out, farm growth is not only suffering from shortage of finance from before this whole crisis, but it's also had a key shortage of skills. And this means not only the type of skills, but the experience we have. So I think, could this not be an opportunity to actually reframe the alignment between industry and higher education institutes? And that means going beyond universities, including polytechnics, as to reframing how we deliver the skills into our firms. I'd be interested in both aspects as to how you view these 2 points.
Well, excellent question, Nazira. Thank you very much. I'll deal with them in reverse order, if I may. Certainly, firm growth, we've got some early evidence. It's unsurprising, but firm growth is completely stalled at the moment, and it's going to be important to think about how to get that back. There was a report written, I think, last week on that, and I'll try and circulate to people looking at the data on firm growth. And you're entirely right. The way our firms have operated in the last 15 or so years is, rather than training their staff, if I could say German style, it's been to sort of go towards migrant staff who are already trained. And I think to the extent to which we can deploy further education colleges and others to provide vocational education and firms to participate in that, I think would be very important. We've been part of a network called the Centre for Vocational Education Research, funded by the Department for Education, that's been looking exactly at these issues. And the interesting thing is that some of the returns from years spent at FE, particularly in STEM subjects, yield lifetime earnings returns, at least to age 30, that are very similar to those you get from degrees. Obviously not necessarily from the University of Glasgow, but from average degrees. And that would be very important to bear that in mind and to get that evidence again in front of ministers and others. So the thing then is to design some frameworks by which small firms can feel able to participate in the education of their workforce, and just accept that they're contributing to the social good by doing that. One of the concerns we generally get when we talk to people like that is, well, I'll train them and they'll go off somewhere else. to be honest, that happens at the Institute. We get wonderful people in like Jeanine and Kemar, and a few years down the line, they go off to the Treasury and the Bank of England and run those instead. But I think that's part of the good. That's you know, I'd love them to stay, but they're so good that there's not a lot I can do. But I'm happy to build the capacity, and I really kind of want firms to go down that route. I'm very pleased to hear the developments of the Scottish National Bank. I'm a little bit away from that. Can I perhaps come back to you that later? I don't know the details of it, but I instinctively am in favour of such developments. The British Business Bank, about which I know a little bit more, is just about guarantees rather than anything else, and I think should be doing a little bit more. So I don't know whether we should open that up now or come back to it later, given we're heading towards the deadline. Can I come back to you, Nazira, on that? Would that be okay?
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. Thank you for your viewpoints. Much appreciated. Thanks.
Not at all. Thank you for your question.
And I'm being told by our host that we now have to wrap it up, I'm afraid. I appreciate there were quite a few more questions, so I'm sorry I wasn't able to come to everyone. But Jagjit, on the Scottish National Investment Bank, absolutely very happy to have a discussion on that. It's of limited scale given what perhaps you might want in this space, but that depends on, it's partly dependent on the fiscal framework that Scotland has. So very happy to have a conversation. I think there is some interesting questions there in terms of post-COVID recovery. Can I thank everyone involved, particularly, of course, the technical team at NIESR, also Jeanine and Kemar, and also all the attendees, but of course, especially you, Jagjit, for not only presenting it so well, but also you know, laying yourself open to lots of questions. And I can tell you there were at least a dozen more questions that we just didn't have time to get to. So hopefully we could do so at tackle some of these things at the next seminar. But thank you again, and hopefully the first of many joint events.
Thank you, Anton. Can I just say one thing? I want to thank Rachel Tukey, our MC, and I wonder if there's a way of us capturing all the questions before we end the seminar, at least in some form, so we can think of constructing some replies in due course. Rachel, is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. We've taken screenshots and we'll get in touch with people individually.
So all of those of you who ask questions, we should try to deal with them, if not immediately, but shortly, and we'll try to get back to you on that. Let me also offer my thanks to Anton and all the team at Glasgow. This is great. We'll try and do this every quarter. Thank you ever so much.